All right, 1 Kings chapter 9. Let's start with prayer. Lord, we just so thankful, Lord, that you are the one who changes us from the inside out. And have your way with us, Lord. We want you to just have our hearts. We want to be surrendered. It's so good to sing songs like that tonight, just to refresh that surrender, that just commitment to you. And Lord, even as we look at this passage tonight of someone who began so well, we're familiar with him, Solomon, and yet at the end of his life, we see tragedy take place because he allowed things to come into his life. And these are things that are constantly bombarding us with, constantly. And so, Lord, we want to be close to you, and we thank you that tonight is part of that process of just fellowship with other believers and encouragement, all those things, and being in your word, how great that is. So minister and speak to us tonight, we pray. In Jesus' name, we all say amen. When the Pope had visited the United States a few years back, one of his meetings went too long, and he had to break away from it to catch a flight. And since the Pope mobile wasn't fast enough, he phoned for a limo. Now, this gets great because the limousine arrived and the driver was kind of surprised. Hey, this is the Pope, you know. And he was a little nervous, so he drove very slowly. So the Pope told him, look, man, you got to speed up. I'm in a rush, you know. Unfortunately, the driver even drove slower, wanting to make sure that, you know, he had the Pope in the limo, you know. That was pretty cool. Well, the Pope couldn't be delayed any longer, so he asked the driver, can you step aside and let me drive the limo? And the driver acquiesced, and the Pope proceeded to floor it. He was going 85 miles an hour, and sure enough, he got pulled over by a police officer. As you can imagine, the police officer was a little bit shocked to see this famous personality behind the wheel. So he frantically called the police chief. Chief, what am I going to do? I've stopped a very important figure for speeding. What do I do? What do you mean, what do you do? The chief said, give him a ticket. He said, but sir, I honestly can't do that. What do you mean you can't? The law is the law. Who'd you pull over? The mayor? No. The governor? No, sir. The president? No, sir, not at all. Well, then who is it then? He said, look, all I know, sir, is that the Pope is the one driving the person in the back. He must be very important. Now, isn't it interesting how easily swayed we are by someone who perhaps is a TV personality or a movie star or in the music field, something like that. And we see this all the time. People that get fame and fortune, they usually have a difficult time keeping their feet on the ground. It's been said that power corrupts and absolute power absolutely corrupts, right? And unfortunately, that's what we're going to see tonight as we look at the next 4 chapters here in 1 Kings, beginning in chapter 9. We come to Solomon again, and he started off so well. However, over a period of time, we see his love for gold, his love for glory, his love for girls. These led to his demise and ultimately a divided kingdom. So let's start into it, chapter 9. It came to pass when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and his house, Solomon's desire, all the things he wanted to do, that the Lord appeared to him a second time as he had in Gideon. So remember, God appeared to him before in chapter 3. This is now the second time he's finished the temple. We saw that last time he finished building his home. And the Lord says, I've heard your prayer, your supplication that you've made before me. I've consecrated this house which you built, which I've put my name there forever. My eyes, my heart will be there perpetually. Now, he reminds them, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart, in uprightness, do according to all I've commanded you, keep my statutes, I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, as I promised David, and you will not have to fail to have a man on the throne. Now, when God said that to David, he obviously wasn't looking for perfection. David was far from that. David made mistakes. Some great sins, but he was a man who was tender, who repented and so forth. And so he says, you need to walk as your father David did to Solomon. But, verse 6, if you or your sons turn from following me, you don't keep my commandments, my statutes, you go and serve other gods, you worship them. Then verse 7, I will cut off Israel from the land which I've given them. And this house, which you just finished building, consecrated my name, I will cast out of my sight. And Israel will be a proverb, a byword among the people. In other words, you'll be a has-been. So For this house, which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished. They'll hiss and will say, why has the Lord done this to this land, to this house? I mean, it was such a spectacular place. What went wrong? And then they will answer, because they forsook the Lord their God, and who brought their fathers out of Egypt. They embraced other gods. They worshiped them. They served them. And the Lord brought this calamity. So now we move ahead, and verse 10 says, it happened at the end of 20 years, when Solomon had finished building the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, that Hiram, the king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress and gold, as much as he desired, that King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. Now, it wasn't wise, first of all, let me say this, for Solomon to do so, for God had told them, you don't give the land to anybody. But Solomon did, and he did it. But Hiram went to see, from Tyre, went to see the cities in verse 12, which Solomon gave him, and they didn't please him. He says, this is what you're giving me, What kind of cities are these, my brother? And he called them the land of Kabul, as they are this day, which means they're good for nothing. Thanks a lot for these cities, And when you get to 2 Chronicles chapter 8, he eventually gives them back to Solomon. So Solomon wanted to give it away. God, by his grace, gave them back. Then Hiram sent the king 120 talents of gold, which, by the way, was about 50 million in gold. So just keep that in mind. It's a lot of money. Solomon keeps amassing a lot of money. And because of that, he continues to build. Verse 15, and for this reason, for the labor force which King Solomon raised, which, by the way, in our last study was about 200,000 strong. They built the house of the Lord, verse 15, his own house. They built the Milo, which was the walled-in part of the city near the city of David. The wall of Jerusalem, Hazar, Megiddo, Gezer. He built all these cities. Now, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and taken Gezer and burned it with fire and killed the Canaanites who dwelt in the city and given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. And so Solomon built Gezer, Lower Beth Haran, and then he mentions these other cities here in verse 18. In verse 19 it says, and all the storage cities that Solomon built. And by the way, archaeologists have covered many of them. When we traverse the land of Israel, when we go there, this is another area that Solomon built. This is another city Solomon built. I mean, he built cities and storage cities throughout the entire land. Cities that, notice it says, for his chariot, cities for his cavalry, whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and Lebanon, all the land of his dominion. So he continued to build. And again, his labor force, verse 20, were the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the termites. No, they weren't. All the descendants and so forth. Verse 22 says, but the children of Israel, Solomon made no forced laborers, because they were men of war, and his servants, his officers, captains, and commanders, and some of them in verse 23 were chiefs. But, verse 24, Pharaoh's daughter came up to the city of David, to her house, which Solomon had built for her. Then he built the Milo. So he had a special place. That was his first wife, not the last, that's for sure. And now, verse 25, 3 times a year Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar which he built to the Lord, and he burnt incense there in the altar that was before the Lord. So he finished the temple. And again, Solomon had a lot of resources. Verse 26, he also built fleet of ships at Geber, which is near Eloth. Then Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, seamen who knew the sea, to work with the servants of Solomon. And he went to Ophir, which is part of East Africa today. He acquired 420 talents of gold from there. That would be about 200 million in gold today. And it was brought to King Solomon. So again, all we're seeing here is that Solomon, after he built, continues to build, continues to get money, and that's kind of the backdrop. Now we come to chapter 10, and we come to a familiar chapter. Now, when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Now, that doesn't mean that she was, giving him an academic test. Now, sit down here. We got this test you're going to have to take, and I want to know if I'm going to, be talking with you. No, what it means is that she came to him with questions dealing with perhaps diplomatic difficulties, perhaps some ethical, and perhaps even some spiritual questions. And she came to Jerusalem, it says, with a very great retinue, which is a large entourage of people with camels who had spices, gold, precious stones. She came to Solomon. She spoke with him about all that was in her heart. And Solomon answered all of her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he built, the food on his table, the servants there, the service of the waiters and their apparel, the cupbearers, the entryway, all those things, it tells us at the end of verse 5, there was no more spirit in her. In other words, it literally took her breath away. She was blown away. And keep in mind, this was a woman who was used to luxury and who was used to royalty. And so she says to the king, it was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I didn't believe it till I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed, not half was told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame which I heard. And then she says, as happy are your men, happy are the servants who are continually in their presence and get to hear your wisdom. And by the way, I would say that that's true today. What a blessing it is when you can work with someone who's wise, who's made wise decisions. Those are the kind of people that you want to look up to and listen to. And of course, what a blessing it was to be one of these servants and be in the presence of King Solomon. However, I like to think of this. I get to serve the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and he speaks to me words of wisdom every day out of his word. So man, I get to come every day and go, wow, right? What a blessing that is. She adds in verse 9, blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel. The Lord has loved Israel. He made you king to do justice and righteousness. Then it tells us, verse 10, she gave the king 120 talents of gold. The same amount Hiram did back in chapter 9. So another 50 million. Here you go. Here's 50 million. And on top of that, spices in great quantity, precious stones. There never again came such abundance of spices as the queen of Sheba gave Solomon. Also, the ships of Hiram, which brought gold. Remember, he had a whole fleet that he'd send out all the time? Well, they brought in great quantities of almug wood and precious stones from East Africa. And the king made steps of this particular wood, and he also used it to engrave, to make his instruments, his harps and his stringed instruments. And there was nothing like that even to this day, it says at the end of verse 12. Now, King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked. And she goes, oh, I like that. Oh, I take it. Oh, that's kind of nice. Oh, have that. Can you imagine that? Anything she asked for, he gave to her, according to the royal generosity. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. Now, you remember, we're familiar with the Queen of Sheba because Jesus actually uses her as an example in the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 12, the scribes and the Pharisees come up to Jesus and say, hey, JC, we'd like to see you do a sign. Do another sign, And of course, they weren't insincere. They had seen Jesus do many signs and heard the words of Jesus, but they really weren't changed by it. They just wanted another dramatic sign. They weren't bent on, changing their hearts. And so Jesus responds to them and says, the Queen of Sheba will rise up in judgment against this generation, against you guys, and condemn you. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And indeed, a greater than Solomon was here. So what he was saying is like, listen, these guys went, Queen of Sheba and all of her entourage went great lengths to hear the wisdom of Solomon, a man. But I'm the Lord. I'm here in your midst. I'm teaching you the truth of the kingdom, and yet you don't want to hear it. You just want another sign. You have no intention of changing. And so it was a rebuke to them. But again, just speaking of this moment right here that we're reading of. Now, moving on, we see more of Solomon's wealth. The weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold, besides traveling merchants that brought other things from Arabia and so forth. So scholars estimate that Solomon was bringing in about $300 million a year. Not bad, right? Not bad for a kingdom. And Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each one. So each shield was about $120,000. And he also made 300 shields of hammered gold. 3 minas of gold went into them. They were about 30,000 each. So all told, there was 500 shields worth about $33 million. Just think about that. Now, why were they used, or where were they put? The king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Remember we mentioned last time that was the name of his house. He named his house the forest of Lebanon. The reason why is because he just lined, the whole thing was made out of cedar from Lebanon. So much that's what he called it. Now, that's where he put all 500 shields. Now, these shields were strictly ornamental. Gold is too heavy, number one, and way too soft to be used as a real shield. So again, unlike his father, David was a real warrior. Solomon was more like a politician, right? And so he builds it, for appearance. Look at what we've done, kind of a thing. He also made, check this out, a great throne of ivory, and then overlaid it with gold. Can you imagine the opulence? You have this beautiful ivory, and it's like, let's just cover that whole thing with gold. I think that'd be kind of cool. Get my entourage over here. We're just going to check it out, dudes. Check out this crib. Check out this place, And this had 6 steps going to it. And on each step on either side, verse 19 says there were 2 lions. So there were 12 lions in all. Can you imagine this? And then in verse 21, it says his drinking vessels were all gold. And all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon, which were in his home, were pure gold. Not one was silver, for that was accounted as nothing. And we got this silver over here. What do you want to do? Silver? Throw it in the pile over there with the rocks, So this just tells us how much money he had. For the king, verse 22, had merchant ships at sea with a fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, they'd come back with gold and silver and ivory and apes and monkeys. Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. And all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. So like the Queen of Sheba, many wanted to hear what he had to say. And they too, when they'd come, would bring gifts. Of course, that's what you do. So it says, verse 25, each would bring a present, articles of silver and gold and garments and armor and spices and horses and mules at a set rate every single year. So again, we just get the idea that Solomon was just so wealthy. Now, here's the thing. When that happens, I talked about when we began, fame, fortune, it changes people. And we see that happen in the news all the time, right? It's very rare that it doesn't. And then they mentioned the proverb. I think this holds true. It's a proverbial saying that riches are like salt water. The more you drink, the more you thirst for it, right? And that's kind of like, we got more. I got to get more. You got plenty. What do you need more for, And then I want to remind you what God said in Deuteronomy 17. Now that takes us back hundreds of years before this moment right here. All the way back in Deuteronomy, God knew that eventually the children of Israel would ask for a king. And God warns them, now there's coming a time when you will have kings. And I'm warning the kings of 3 things. You shall not multiply horses to yourselves. You shall not multiply wives to yourselves. And you shall not multiply silver and gold to yourselves. Solomon, he did all 3. He did all 3. First of all, as we see here already, he multiplied money to himself, right? But secondly, horses. Look at verse 26. Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen. He stationed them in chariot cities. He had complete cities that were just for his horses and the chariots. And we've gone to that when we go to Israel. You go see chariot cities. He made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone. So now it's just a pile of rocks over there. That's the silver. We just keep it over there, Also, Solomon had horses imported from Egypt, and the king's merchants would bring them at the current price. Now, verse 29, a chariot that was imported from Egypt would cost such and such a money, and it's kind of mentioned here and so forth. So what I simply want you to see, this was a direct violation of Scripture. Now, why did God say, don't multiply horses to yourselves? Sounds crazy for us. Well, back then, that was what made your army superior. More horses, a superior army. Chariots, a more superior army. And so God didn't want them leaning and trusting upon themselves. And so we think of what David wrote in Psalm 20 and verse 7. He wrote this, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord. That'd be like us saying, we trust in our military. We trust in our nation. We trust in who we are. But hold on a second. We need to trust in the Lord, right? So a king who would amass a large army of horses could be tempted to say, man, I don't need to pray to God. I don't need to trust in God. I've got a powerful army. What do I need to worry about all my borders? They're taken care of, and I've got plenty of money. I could buy even some mercenaries to help me out. Isn't it interesting that when God blesses us, we are often tempted to just kind of back away from God? Isn't that true? I mean, think about it. We get a good job. We get a good home. We get a good ride. Everything seems to be, running into place. We got the stuff. And all of a sudden, slowly but surely, we're not trusting in God as much as we used to. And listen, we live in a prevalent area. Not only is the United States more abundant than most people around the world, we live better than 80% of the world, first of all of us in the United States. And then we live in a very prevalent area ourselves. And you know what? It's so easy to put God on the back burner. And you know how many times I've seen that? Thousands. I'm not 100. I've seen it personally, being a pastor, thousands of times. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see people once, I'm so hungry for God. I'm just so hungry for God. He's going to be first. But then the almighty dollar or busyness in another area becomes that which just takes people away from the Lord. And you know what's interesting? Take away the house, take away the car, take away the money, take all this stuff. And you know what happens? We tend to, oh God, I need you, right? Sometimes that's what God does to get our attention. So Solomon multiplied money. He multiplied horses. Oh, and now we get to the third one, chapter 11. Solomon loved many foreign women. Yikes. As well as the daughter of Pharaoh. That was his first wife. But he also liked Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. Man, he really, he was an equal opportunity husband, Where are you from? I like that too, right? From all the nations, the Lord said to the children of Israel, you should not intermarry with them. Or are they with you? Surely they will turn your hearts away after other gods. That's exactly what happened. But notice the end of that verse. Solomon clung to these in love. So he loved gold, he loved glory, he loved girls. He had 700 wives. Are you kidding me? Notice it says princesses. That's because most of his wives were arranged marriages. This is how he would, he'd make treaties with other nations. That's how they grew. And he'd, I'll take those daughters and those gals over there. And 300 concubines. Now, a concubine was a legal partner back in ancient times, but not on the same status as a wife. But he had 1,000 women. That's crazy. That guy's crazy, right? And his wives, here's the sad part, turned away his heart. For so it was when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods. His heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Now understand, compromise for Solomon wasn't overnight. It was gradual. I mean, at one time he just married one wife, right? And then at one time he was only married to two. And then one time he was only married to three. And one time he was only married to 5. And then it was 200, and then it was 300, But it slowly but surely, it happens, right? Sometimes our spiritual values can be replaced by a love for other things. And this is what happened. And what's really tragic is that these wives moved him into an even deeper sin. He went after other gods. For Solomon, verse 5, went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, which was of the Ammonites. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He didn't fully follow the Lord. Verse 7 tells us he built a high place for Chemosh. Also, it says in that verse, after Molech. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to other gods. This is hard to believe. And this is Solomon, right? Now, Ashtoreth is the fertility goddess of the Sidonians. And this would involve, just religious orgies and even legalized prostitution. That was part of it. Chemosh was very similar to the same, of the worship of Ashtoreth. Molech and Milcom were very similar. And these two were done by different nations. But these two, both of them involve the sacrificing of young children alive in a fire. Both of them. I mean, that's just disgusting, grotesque, and horrible. But he fell in love with these women. He slowly but surely gave into what they want to do, and disaster. So that, verse 9 says, the Lord became angry. God is now angry with Solomon because his heart turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. I mean, God says, I appeared to you twice. And he had commanded him concerning these things. Don't go after other gods. But he didn't keep the commandment. So what God is saying is, I showed unusual favor to him. And I believe that's true of all of us. God has shown unusual favor to all of us. Do you ever think that? I think that way. I think that time, God, why wasn't I born, in, in India? Why wasn't I born there? I could have been born there. It's just by the grace of God we're born here. God has shown us unusual favor. And we've heard the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we're following the Lord. So, man, to turn away from that is serious. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 4:23, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. But you know what? Solomon eventually failed to take his own counsel. He didn't guard his heart. He didn't keep it with diligence. Therefore, the Lord says to him in verse 11, because you've done this and have not kept my covenant, my statutes, which I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you, and I'll give it to a servant. Nevertheless, I won't do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I'll tear it out of the days of your son when he's ruling. So God had promised, I will keep a dynasty because of you, David, and God will fulfill that. But he's also going to rip the whole kingdom. The kingdom is now going to become a divided kingdom. And he now begins to put this judgment in motion. So first of all, just by setting up adversaries against Solomon. So that last part of Solomon's life was just one of dealing with conflict. He had adversaries. The Lord raised up, verse 14, the adversary against Solomon, Hadad. He was an Edomite. And it happened when David was in Edom and Joab was his commander. And they killed all these males in Edom. And we're told in verse 17 that Hadad had fled to Egypt, And he was still a little child. So he escaped from this whole activity. Then there arose from Midian, and he came to Paran, verse 18, and they took men from him, and he came down to Egypt. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave him a house, apportioned food for him, gave him land. So all of a sudden he found asylum in Egypt. And Hadad also found favor in the sight of Pharaoh, so that he gave him as wife the sister of his own wife, that is the sister, Queen Taphanes. So this guy ends up marrying, he's related to, the Pharaoh. Then the sister of Taphanes bore him a son and so forth. But anyways, the whole point is he became aligned with Pharaoh. So he's a prince there. He'd become a powerful man. So, verse 21, when Hadad heard in Egypt that David had rested with his fathers and that Joab was dead, he said to Pharaoh, hey, let me go back to my country. And Pharaoh said, well, what have you lacked being with me? Why do you want to do that? He said, okay, but go ahead and go. So Hadad did. Now, Hadad knew he couldn't usurp the throne from Solomon, but God raised him up to be an irritant, an adversary all the days of Solomon's life. Now, he raised up another one, and we're told that in verse 33. His name was Rezin. And in 2 Samuel chapter 8, David had conquered this area. But this guy, Rezin, had fled. And he gathered men to him in verse 24 and became a captain of a band of raiders when David had killed those people in Zobah. That was the area. And he went to Damascus. So that's the place up north. And he reigned in Damascus. So he was to the north. He too, verse 25, was an adversary of Israel all the days of Solomon, besides the trouble that Hadad caused as well. So think about this. Hadad harassed Solomon to the south. He was down from the south, come up from Egypt. And Rezin was from Damascus, near what modern day Syria. And he harassed Solomon from the north. So here is Solomon dealing with these adversaries. But it gets worse. Not only was it from without, it was from within. Look at verse 26. Then Solomon's servant Jeroboam, he was an Ephraimite, so he was a Jew, whose mother's name was Zerah. He rebelled against the king. And this is what caused him to rebel against the king. Solomon had built the Milo. Again, that's the area near the city of David, the wall down there. And the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor. And Solomon, seeing that he was a young man, he was industrious, he made him an officer over the labor force of the house of Joseph. So he was one of the main overseers of that responsibility down there, that building project. Now it happened, verse 29, in time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah, he was from Shiloh, met him on the way. And he'd clothed himself in a new garment, and the two of them were alone in the field. And Ahijah took hold of his new garment that was on him, and he tore it into 12 pieces, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And he says to Jeroboam, take for yourselves 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord. Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon. I'm going to give 10 tribes to you. So the wheels are already in motion. God said, Solomon, you're going to remain on your throne, but your son's going to deal with problems. And now it's set in motion. He tells this guy Jeroboam, you're going to take 10 of the tribes. But he says, I have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I've chosen. So I have one there for Solomon's son. Now you say, well, that's 11. Well, understand that Benjamin had been swallowed up into the tribe of Judah at this time. So it was really 2 tribes were part of the southern kingdom. That's Judah and Benjamin. But God tells Jeroboam through this prophet Ahijah, I'm going to give you 10 tribes to rule. And why is that? Well, because of Solomon. He's forsaken me, verse 33. He's gone after Ashtoreth, Chemosh, Milcom. He's walked in the ways that are not right in my eyes. He hasn't kept my judgment as his father David did. However, verse 34, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, because I've made him a ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose because he kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and I'm giving you 10 tribes. So he's telling Jeroboam, it's not going to happen right now. This is a prophecy through this prophet, but once Solomon dies, it's going to happen. And to his son, that's Solomon's son, I'm going to give one tribe, that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city which I've chosen for myself to put my name there. So I will take you, you'll reign over all your heart desires, you'll be king over Israel. And by the way, that's when we refer to, so in the future, when you hear from this point on, when you hear Israel mentioned and Judah mentioned, Israel refers to the northern 10 tribes of Israel. Judah refers to the south, which is Judah and Benjamin. And he tells them in verse 38, this is to Jeroboam, this is amazing. Through the prophet, he says, indeed, if you do what God commands you, and God says, if you walk in my ways, if you do what is right in my sight, if you keep my statutes, my commandments, as David did, then I will be with you and build for you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. That's an amazing promise. So God is now doing with Jeroboam exactly what he told David. I'm giving you the 10 tribes of Israel. And if you walk in my ways, you will have a perpetual son remain on the throne. Wow. In other words, I will establish a dynasty through you. Now, this dynasty would not replace David's dynasty that continues in the south, because this Messiah will come through David. But he would have a dynasty to the north. He had such opportunity. So think of the opportunity he has. What would that be? If it's like, I'm going to establish you, do this great work. What an amazing thing. God gave a promise like that to Abraham. Abraham was faithful. God gave a promise like that to David. David was faithful. God gave this promise to Jeroboam. He wasn't faithful. He blows it as we move on, right from the get-go, in fact. Now, at this point, he has nothing but divine opportunity. And he tells them, I'm going to afflict the descendants, verse 39, of David because of this, but not forever. Now, when Solomon hears about this, so Solomon gets word that this prophet has told, Jeroboam, he's going to rule the 10 kingdoms to the south. Therefore, Solomon, verse 40, sought to kill Jeroboam. I'm going to stop the plan of God. Oh, that's a good one, really? But Jeroboam arose, he fled to Egypt, and he was there with the king of Egypt until the death of Solomon. Now, the rest of the acts of Solomon, all he did, his wisdom, aren't they written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? And the period that he reigned was 40 years. Verse 43, he rested with his fathers. He was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, this is where it gets confusing, Jeroboam to the north, and Rehoboam, that's Solomon's son, would reign in Solomon's place, that's to the south. But again, just here we see the demise, the end of Solomon's life. We always think, man, Solomon was great. He had such opportunity. He did all this for God. Yeah, but at the end, he totally blew it. He went after gold, girls, glory. He blew it. He blew it. Now, chapter 12, and we'll finish this chapter tonight. Rehoboam, he goes to Shechem. For all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. Now, this is interesting. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. He's the next king in the south. But what does he do? Instead of being coronated in Jerusalem, which would be the common sense place to do it, he goes to the north. Why? Well, he knew about this prophecy. He's thinking, no, these 10 tribes are going to stay here with me, So he went there. But it happened when Jeroboam heard it. Remember, he's down in Egypt now, fleeing from King Solomon, but now Solomon's dead. The people, verse 3, sent and called for him. So the other tribe is saying, okay, Jeroboam, time to come back. So he comes up, and he shows up at Rehoboam's coronation. Then Jeroboam and the whole assembly, verse 3 of Israel, came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, your father made our yoke heavy. Remember, Jeroboam was over the workforce. He knew what it was like to work under Solomon, and he didn't like it. He made it heavy and hard. Now, therefore, lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. So Jeroboam is now representing all the tribes to the north. And he's basically saying, look, we'll serve you. We need some negotiations here. Your dad was a heavy taskmaster. He had no really interaction with us, and we understand why. The guy had 1,000 wives. He was never available, right? He's doing his own thing and never doing with the people. He says, yeah, get him to work, kind of a thing. So he says, we got to talk about this. So Rehoboam, that's Solomon's son, says, well, depart for 3 days, come back. And the people departed. So I like this. Rehoboam, to his credit, at least didn't answer right away. And there's wisdom in that. Sometimes people ask us something and we feel pressured to give an answer right away. And the best thing is, no, wait. Wait on the Lord, Sometimes, well, I didn't get an answer right away. I asked you this question yesterday. Well, hold on, I'm praying about it. Pray. Not only that, he waited, but unfortunately he didn't pray. We never read that he prayed. But his first move after that was good. King Rehoboam, verse 6, consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived and said, how do you advise me to answer the people? Now that was wise. Proverbs 24:6. Solomon was right. Under the inspiration of Scripture, he said, in the multitude of counselors, there's safety. And that is so true. And Rehoboam actually goes to those men who are actually in the presence of the wisest man who ever lived. That was good. And he says, what do you think I should say? And they said, well, if you will be a servant to these people. So if you're a leader, yeah, you're a leader, but you're also to be a servant. Be a servant and serve them and answer them and speak good words to them. And they'll be servants to you. You be a servant and they'll be a servant to you, right? Well, that's a great thing. When you think of great men, think of Moses. You know what God says about Moses? Moses, my servant. Jesus, a servant of all, right? Jesus said, if we want to be great, be a servant. So they wisely told him that. But you know what? Verse 8, he rejected the advice which the elders had given him. And he consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. So he rejects the wise counselors and he goes to his own peers, the men he had grown up with. And they say to him in verse 9, he asks them, what advice do you give? How should we answer the people who have saying, lighten the yoke which my father put on them, The young men said to him in verse 10, thus you shall speak to this people who you've spoken to, saying, your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. This is what you need to say. My little finger will be thicker than my father's waist. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I'm going to add to your yoke. And my father chastised you with whips, I'm going to chastise you with scourges. I'm going to put little bits of bone on it when we whip you and make it worse, Wow, that's harsh. But you know what? These young men obviously wanted a name for themselves. And one of the best ways they thought of doing that is by showing force. Young people are often tempted to do that. They generally speaking, they want to, demonstrate authority. Oh, I got authority, I got force, and that somehow is supposed to make them feel big or whatever. But the thing is, the Bible tells us that God resists the proud. He gives grace to the humble. So it was just brash, it was proud. So Jeroboam, all the people came to Rehoboam the third day. So they came back. I wonder what Rehoboam's going to say. And he answered the people roughly, verse 13. He rejected the advice of the elders that they had given. He spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy. I'm going to add to your yoke. My father chastised you with the whips. I'm going to do it with scourges. I like what one commentator wrote. With a dozen rash words, Rehoboam, the bungling dictator, opened the door to 400 years of strife, weakness, and eventually the destruction of the nation. Yeah, this led to a divided nation that was never healed. What a tragedy. So the king, verse 15, didn't listen to the people. And then it says this, for the turn of events was from the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which he had spoken through the prophet Ahijah, right? Saying Jeroboam, will be, the next king. And he would be. So it was obviously of the Lord as well. Nonetheless, of course, Rehoboam was responsible for his own actions. And I just want to mention a few lessons I would see at that. I think this is good for all of us to hear. Those of us certainly that have positions of authority, be you a pastor or a manager or a supervisor or any authority, be a servant. Be a servant. Yes, you have to give forth, mandates and so forth, but you can do it in love. You don't have to be brash. People are more responsive to love than they are lashes, right? And so we don't have to flex our muscles like Rehoboam did. It caused people to despise his authority. And then secondly, just thinking of the other side, we need to be careful who we take our advice from, right? We need to be careful who we take our advice from. You can always find someone who will agree with you what you want to hear from them. I see this in counseling. People will go from counselor to counselor to counselor till they find someone who tell them what they want to hear. And you can always do that, especially if you pay people. You'll eventually find someone who will tell you what you want to hear. But what you want to do is you want to go to someone who is godly. Someone who's going to give good, biblical, sound advice. And heed that. Heed that. Whether you like it or not, because you know that they're looking out for your best. And it's from God's word. So we want to be careful who we take advice by. Of course, Rehoboam made a big mistake. Now, verse 16, when all Israel saw that the king didn't listen to them, the people answered the king saying, what share have we in David? We have no inheritance in Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Again, that's the 10 northern tribes. See to your own house, O David. So Israel departed to their tents. So now the 10 tribes go to the north, and Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah, which again includes the tribe of Benjamin. Now, King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue. So most likely he comes back to Jerusalem and he sends a guy, hey, let's go and try and negotiate some kind of agreement. Let's get back together, But this guy was a foolish choice because he's responsible for the revenue. They might have thought he wanted money or something. I don't know, but they all stoned him with stones and he died. So Rehoboam thought, okay, this is pretty serious. So he mounted his chariot, he made haste, he fled to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Now, it came to pass when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had come back, they sent for him, called him to the congregation, and they made him king over Israel. So he was king over the 10 tribes to the north. And there was none who followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. Rehoboam came to Jerusalem. He assembled all the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin. Again, there I said they were included in that. And he gathered together 180,000 chosen men who were warriors to fight against Israel, that he might restore it back to himself. So immediately says, civil war. I'm not going to let this happen. We're going to fight him, But the word of the Lord came to Shemaiah. He was a prophet. And he said, speak to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, to all the house of Judah, to Benjamin, to the rest of the people. You shall not go up nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Let every man return to his house, for this thing is of me. Listen, this is because of Solomon's disobedience. And of course, they obeyed the word of the Lord, and they went back home. Then we read that Jeroboam built Shechem in the mountains of Ephraim. He dwelt there. And so actually, Shechem actually became the first capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And think about this. Jeroboam at this point, again, has much opportunity, right? He can now establish a dynasty. All he has to do is serve the Lord there, do what God has called him to do, and so forth. But now we come to verse 26. Jeroboam said in his heart, now wait a second. The kingdom, all my 10 tribes, they may go back to the house of David. What if they go back? You see, verse 27, if these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of the people will turn back to the Lord and Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they'll kill me and they'll go back to Rehoboam. So here's his fear. 3 times a year, every Jew was required to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast. That was in the law. These are Jews. And he knows what's going to happen is 3 times a year, they have to go all the way to Jerusalem. That's the only place where the temple is. And they have to offer up sacrifices to God. And once they see their brothers, they say, hey, brother, shalom, shalom. We're all brothers. Let's just get along. Let's be united in the kingdom. What were we thinking? Kind of a thing. And Jeroboam's thinking, then I'm going to lose, my power. Therefore, the king asked advice. Not good advice. Why? Because he made 2 calves of gold and said to the people, it is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought them from the land of Egypt. I don't know about you, but does that sound familiar? That's exactly what they said when Moses was on the mountaintop a long time. They made a golden calf. This is the God that brought us out of Egypt. And it tells us, verse 29, he put one in Bethel. That's the southernmost part of the northern kingdom. And he put one in Dan. That's the uttermost part of the north of their territory. So he put these here so that they could worship there. They could worship their gods there and not go back down to Jerusalem. What he did is he created a religion of convenience. Man, it's too much. We don't need to go down to Jerusalem. And actually, when we go to Israel every time, we'll go to the area of Dan. We go to Dan because there they've uncovered the actual ruins that were set up by Jeroboam. And the actual compound was about the same size exactly as the temple. It was laid out the same way with a brazen altar and everything. They just made a golden calf. So they made the worship very similar. And they just said, you don't have to go to Jerusalem. You can just do whatever you want here. And you just worship this golden calf. It was a religion of convenience. And what a tragic thing. Verse 30, this thing became a sin for the people, and they went to worship as one went as far as Dan. What a tragic thing. And he made shrines on the high places. And here's another thing. He made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi. God said only the Levites could be the priests. But he said, you want to be a priest? You're a priest. You want to be a priest? You're a priest. It's cool. And anybody could be a priest. Just all go there. We're going to do our thing. It's going to be cool. We'll do our religious thing. We'll all stay here. I'll have my power. It's awesome. So Jeroboam ordained a feast, verse 32, on the 15th day of the 8th month. Like the feast that was in Judah. Yeah, that's the exact time where they commemorate the Feast of Tabernacles. So it coincided. You don't need to go there. You stay here. We'll do our celebration here. And he offered sacrifices on the altar. He did at Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he made. He in Bethel as well installed priests in high places. He made offerings there. And notice in verse 33, it says right in the middle, in the month which he had devised in his own heart. Jeroboam had done this whole thing from his own heart. Why? Because he just didn't want to lose it. God promised him, I'll establish you. Just seek me first. And he didn't. He said, man, it's too tempting. I'm afraid they'll leave. And so I need to do my own thing. I need to come up with my own religion, this whole thing. And man, his heart went way, way from God. He had calves to worship, shrines to worship, altars to sacrifice on, priests to lead in the worship. What a mess. We get to chapter 13 next time, and God, of course, judges him. So think about this. In these 4 chapters, we have 3 huge disappointments. The first one is Solomon. Rather than being sold out, this is Solomon had so much opportunity. Instead, he goes after gold, glory, and girls. Then you have Rehoboam, his son. Had he listened to the wise counsel he was given, he could have again been the ruler of Egypt, of Israel. But instead, another guy, the third disappointment, Jeroboam comes up from Egypt, right? And he has an opportunity, and he blows it as well. He goes after other gods. All 3 of them. Man, I don't know about you, but isn't that scary? Yeah, that's 3 strikes. And that's not good. And you know what? When you read through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, which we're going through, very, very few times do we ever read there was a king who had a loyal heart towards God. We always read this, and there was a king, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. The next king, he did evil in the sight. It's only every once in a while that we have a godly man on the throne. Which again comes back to that, what Jesus said, narrow is the way and difficult is the way that leads to life, but broad is the way and wide is the gate that leads to destruction, and many go that way. So for us, gang, we need to be single-minded, have a single heart. To me, this is just always a good reminder. We got to keep our eyes on Jesus. Amen. We really do. Let's pray.